Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Today, we have a very special guest, Michael Karras. Michael Karras is making a lot of noise in the preterist community. He's been the leading challenger from the full preterist camp, challenging the IO preterists. Now, Mike and I, we had a hot seat debate last year, and I enjoyed it very much. It was very beneficial to those in the preterist community. And I just want to give my sincere appreciations to Mike and just being a good sport, just challenging other views. And, I'm hoping that this would inspire other leading voices of full preterism to engage. So, Mike, thank you so very much for coming on. From my understanding, you do want to give a presentation, correct?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. And there's going to be question and answer sessions after the presentation. So those of you guys that are going to be waiting for this, I've already got your questions. They're already ready to be presented. But just keep in mind, everybody, that Mike is going to give a presentation challenging the Israel only paradigm. And then after that, we will be addressing the question and answer portion of this podcast. Okay, so Mike, without further ado, you have the floor.
Awesome. Yeah. Tristan, thank you so much for allowing me to have a voice. And I look forward to share my views. I'm probably not the most qualified, but I'm a willing candidate. So I'm going to offer some thoughts on the Old Testament. We're going to slide into the New as far as why I think Israel only is not biblical and coherent, and be happy to take your questions after that. So we're going to begin with the Old Testament. Let me pull that up. So bear with me 1 second. All right, so let me make that smaller. Apologize for the delay.
And do you want to share your screen? You can share your screen if you wish. Like if you have a PowerPoint, I can go ahead and present it if you want to share your screen.
I appreciate that. Yeah, that won't be necessary.
Okay.
Actually, yeah, I'm not so skilled. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read my presentation. So to let people know, I prefer to, I love God, I love people, I love studying, but I'm not a debater. That's why I don't engage in active debates. So I'm going to read off the presentation. Hopefully I can articulate afterwards through Q&A. We're going to start with the Old Testament, and we're going to go through Genesis. We're going to start with the Exodus, right? So we all know the story with Israel. They're basically in bondage to Pharaoh in Egypt. God is going to call them out, and they're going to have their own Exodus and salvation, and they're coming into their promised land flowing with milk and honey, right? So in the story of Exodus, we know a mixed multitude came out of Egypt along with Israel. According to Exodus scholars Nahum Sarna and William Propp, the mixed multitude refers to a conglomeration of foreigners, including other enslaved in Egypt, mercenaries, and possibly even Egyptians who sympathized with the Hebrews. We know, according to Genesis 25:6, Abraham entrusted all that he had to Isaac. So Isaac would have taken in many of the 300 fighting men, their families, and servants as part of his own household. So the Exodus and salvation event for national Israel included both descendants and non-descendants of Israel. We know, according to Numbers 14:29-31, with the exceptions of Joshua and Caleb, God declared that those over 20 years old at the time of the Exodus would not enter the promised land due to their unbelief and disobedience. This group would have included any children among the Israelites as well as children from among the mixed multitude. They had nothing to do with the rebellion or the unbelief. These non-Israelites would have been included among the category of stranger who was present at the giving of the laws governing the Passover. That's Exodus 12. They were present at the giving of the covenant law under Moses, Exodus 19-24. The renewal of the covenant law under Moses, that's Deuteronomy 29. and the renewal of the covenant law under Joshua in Exodus 24. So you can read those accounts and notice that the strangers are also among them. According to Deuteronomy 10, 17 through 19, Yahweh loved the stranger and stated that God regardeth not persons, which in essence meant God shows no partiality, which contextually highlights that God is impartial, meaning he doesn't show favoritism based on social status, wealth, or power in that particular context. Peter shares similar sentiments when he states in Acts 10, 34 through 35, then Peter opened up his mouth and said, of truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation that feareth him worketh righteousness is accepted with him. Both Deuteronomy 10:17 in both the Hebrew and the Septuagint and Acts 10:34 derive from the same Hebraic concept of one who does not lift or open faces. It's a strange sort of idiom, but basically in essence, it's an expression to denote one who is impartial. So I think that you can find that Peter's likely drawing at least from that principle that God didn't regard or show partiality. Ancient Israel was acquainted with two classes of strangers, the resident stranger and the stranger who sojourning in the land may have been temporary. In contrast with the temporary sojourner, the resident stranger lived permanently in his adopted community. He was a protected stranger who was totally dependent on his patrons for his well-being. We can see examples of this resident stranger in Deuteronomy 24, 9 through 11, with those strangers who sojourned in the camp, in Joshua 8, 34 through 35, and the stranger who was conversant among them, which meant one who walked and lived among the Israelites. These strangers were those who lived in the promised land. They would have been circumcised. They worshiped Yahweh, enjoy the blessings and protections of Yahweh, as well as participated in the temple cultus. We read in Deuteronomy 29, 9 through 15, when a covenant under Moses was renewed, it was established and entered into among those of Israel, as well as a stranger in thy camp. According to Leviticus 17, 8, 5 through 16, the stranger who sojourned among Israel could offer burnt sacrifices and offerings and could be seen as ritually clean and unclean. Covenantal terms meant for Israel, which is applying to the non-Israelite stranger. I want to read a couple of verses from Numbers just to strengthen this point. In Numbers 15, with verse 13, all born of the country shall do all these things after this manner, in offering an offering made by fire of a sweet Savior unto the Lord. And if a stranger sojourn with you, or whosoever be among you in your generations, and will offer an offering made by fire of a sweet Savior unto the Lord, as ye do, so he shall do also. One ordinance shall be for you, for the congregation, and also for the stranger that sojourneth among you. An ordinance which is forever in your generations, as you are, so shall the stranger be before the Lord. One law, one manner shall be for you, and for the stranger that sojourneth with you. Verse 25 through 30. And the priest shall make atonement for all the congregation of the children of Israel. It shall be forgiven them, for it is in ignorance that they bring their offering of sacrifice made by fire unto the Lord, and their sin offering before the Lord, for their ignorance. It shall be forgiven all the congregation of the children of Israel and the stranger that sojourneth among you, seeing all the people were in ignorance. Again, you have one law for him that sinneth through ignorance, both for him that is born among the children of Israel and the stranger that sojourneth among them. For the soul that doeth aught presumptuously, whether he is born in the land or a stranger, the same reproacheth the Lord, and that soul shall be cut off from among his people. The ordinance in Numbers 15:29 aligns with the earlier laws with Leviticus 4 through 5, which prescribes sin offerings for unintentional sins, regardless whether the sinner is an Israelite or a resident foreigner, or ger in a Hebrew. The law of atonement applied universally to both Israelites and resident non-Israelites, or the gerim. These verses in Torah are chronologically set before the United Monarchy split and demonstrate non-Israelite stranger or foreigner were part of the collective nation of Israel. Even if someone would argue that after the split, this would also come to include Israelites not born in the land, but traveled to Israel to sojourn among other Israelites, there's no problem there, because that doesn't change the general category of strangers and how Israel's laws would apply to all of them. To reinforce the fact that ancient Jews regarded these strangers as non-Israelite foreigners, the Greek Septuagint renders the Hebrew word for foreigner in these verses as proselytos, which is where we get the word proselyte from, which is one who converted to the religion of the Hebrews. The resident stranger participated in Passover, that's Exodus 12, 48 through 49, the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, Deuteronomy 16, 10 through 11, the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, that's Deuteronomy 16, 13 through 14, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, Leviticus 16, 29, and of course the Sabbath, Exodus 20, verse 10. So when the author of Psalm 147, 19 through 20, penned, "He sheweth his word unto Jacob, and his statutes and judgments unto Israel, he hath not dealt so with any other nation. As for his judgments, they have not known them." For he's not arguing those statutes and judgments only. He was not arguing those statutes and judgments only applied to ethnic Israel. We've already demonstrated that was not the case. Psalm 147, 19 through 20 is emphasizing Israel's privilege and special status in receiving Torah and the covenant. But that does not mean these statutes or judgments were not applicable to non-Israelite strangers who sojourned among them. Israel was not just an ethnic delineation, but Israel also represented a nation, which consisted of both Israelites and non-Israelite strangers. So it's this kind of selective cherry picking and hasty generalization argument fallacies that runs at the heart of IO. They'll isolate a verse, sharpshooter tactics, as if that's all the context says in all the Bible. He has not chosen any other nation but Israel and given his laws to no one else. But that didn't mean, obviously, other nations among them who enjoined themselves to Yahweh in the covenant. Those laws did not apply to them as well. And while we're at it, let me address another favorite cherry of IO, the idea of cherry picking. Amos 3, 1 through 2, which reads, "Hear this, the word of the Lord is spoken against you, O children of Israel, against the whole family which I brought up against the land of Egypt, saying, you only have I known of all the families of the earth, therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities." So the idea is when he brought up Israel out of Egypt, then he's saying, you have I known among all the families of the earth, implying that what God's saying here prior to calling Israel, the earth had once again become as empty and void as the prior covenant nations of Noah abandoned and rebelled against Yahweh. And thus God chose Israel of all the families of the earth. That didn't mean that God didn't once know Adam and his seed, or didn't once know Noah and his seed. At the time that God called Israel, the covenant world had become once again dark and void. Thus, none of the nations had knew Yahweh at that point. So God chose Israel out of the nations to be his firstborn, initially called as a kingdom of priests, to manifest his name and glory once again in the earth. What the text is not saying is that non-Israelites could not come to know or experience God through Israel. IO simply doesn't understand or want to understand that, yes, it is true the promises and covenants were to Israel, but it's also true that God's blessings could come through Israel, which is the whole point of Genesis 12:3. In raising up Israel, right, God's going to bless Israel, give his Jacob or Abraham's seed, give him a great name, make him a great nation, bless them so that they can in turn bless all the families of the earth. That is the theology presented in Genesis 12:3. Ultimately, that's being fulfilled in Christ, and we'll take a look at that. King Solomon, according to Scripture, was one of the wisest men who ever lived. He states in 1 Kings 8:41 through 43, "Moreover, concerning a stranger that is not of thy people Israel, who comes out from a far country for thy name's sake, for they will hear of your great name and thy strong hand and outstretched arm, when he shall come and pray towards this house, hear thou in heaven in thy dwelling place, and do according to all that the stranger calleth thee to do, that all the people of earth may know your name, to fear you, as do thy people Israel, that they may know that this house which I have builded is called by your name. According to Deuteronomy 4:5-8, the laws and decrees that were given to Israel functioned as a light to the nations, to make both Israel and Yahweh known to the nations. This was at the heart of Israel's original call and mandate as God's firstborn, as a kingdom of priests and holy nation, serve as a blessing to the families of the earth. In closing out this segment regarding the Old Testament non-Israelite inclusion, just in that small segment, it baffles me that anyone who reads the Old Testament or will listen to this material comes to the conclusion of Israel only. In my opinion, it doesn't get any better for IO when it comes to the New Testament. But since I know these objections will come up, let me address these now. And this is dealing with Ezra and Nehemiah. So in short, Ezra and Nehemiah, the context there regarding the mixed multitude is that they were addressing the problem of idolatry and corruption, not necessarily ethnicity. So if anyone they're not familiar with the story, Ezra and Nehemiah, they're probably around 450 BC, trying to establish the nation of Israel, but they're once again intermingling with the foreign nations that are in idolatry and paganism, and obviously Torah forbid that. So although Ezra and Nehemiah were great leaders, they weren't prophets. So they didn't have a thus saith the Lord. So their actions were based on unique historical circumstances, and let me just rephrase that. Their actions were based on unique historical circumstances and unique applications of Mosaic law, and not some new divine revelation. So if you don't know the story, they put their wives and their children away that were basically in paganism, and they divorced their wives and sent them out. Ezra's decree was based on Deuteronomy 7:1-4, which is a prohibition of marriage with 7 Canaanite nations. Ezra expanded this list to include the Egyptians. But remember, in Deuteronomy 23:7-8, it says, do not detest the Edomites or Egyptians, because they are your relatives and they lived as foreigners among you. The third generation of Edomites and Egyptians may enter the assembly of the Lord. Moses himself was married to a Cushite. So I bring this up to show why it's important not to cherry pick certain narratives that only support your view, and realize that all these have unique circumstances and contexts. Let me see where else I just left off. Okay, yep. Original ban in Deuteronomy 7 focused on Canaanites because they were idolaters who posed a threat to Israel's faith. Deuteronomy 7:4 states God's concerns that they would turn away your sons from following me. Regarding Nehemiah, most scholars understand Nehemiah 13 was not kicking foreigners out of the land of Israel, but that these foreigners were simply expelled from being admitted to the corporate privileges of Jews as part of the holy assembly of Israel. So these foreigners were not prohibited from worshiping Yahweh or keeping his laws. They just couldn't do it in the assembly of Israel, which was a sacred space for the Israelites. Nehemiah was merely a governor of Judea, so clearly this edict wasn't to force the foreigners out of the land of Israel, because Nehemiah didn't have that kind of jurisdiction to begin with. So Nehemiah 13:3 is drawing from Deuteronomy 23:3, which states, no Ammonite or a Moabite or any descendant may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. So neither Ezra or Nehemiah were Moses or Jesus. They're dealing with different historical contexts and circumstances. Neither the context nor actions of Ezra and Nehemiah have anything to do with the person and ministry of Jesus. Jesus makes it clear through Paul that God rejected ethnic-only religion. He did away with class and gender. For Paul states, there's neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised, uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave-free, male or female. Christ is all and in all. You can see that in Colossians 3-11, Galatians 3-28. And so that's just setting a context for the New Testament. And I'm just going to briefly touch on that, Tristan, and we can get into the Q&A. So that didn't take long at all. You have any questions for me until I proceed for that?
I have no questions, but
No,
I
sure.
know that
Question.
there are many that do.
No problem at
I'm
all.
sorry, what was it? Okay, yeah, go ahead and
I'll finish up the New
go ahead and
Testament and we can get going.
finish.
All right. So the New Testament,
Perfect.
I'm going to be drawing from the theology of Paul. I think what a lot of people do, and which is strange for Israel only, because most of them are mythicists and atheists. I'm not making that up. I mean, there's Morgan Bradford and Michael Bradley and DaCosta and Charlie Patterson. They've all admitted publicly that they're mythicists and biblical atheists. Let's just say that. And so what you shouldn't do is sort of lump all these kind of historical texts together. It is the Bible, but what you should do is what scholars do is take every author and every writing and evaluate it on its own merit and its own basis. So we're going to get into the Gospels and other writings, but I want to deal with Paul, and if we can kind of understand that Paul has his own unique way of communicating, his own theology that he's presenting, his own influence as someone who may have sat in a Gamaliel. He's influenced by Judaism, but also influenced by Greco-Roman philosophy. So I'm going to suggest that the idea of the nations, as they were a part of national Israel, Paul sees no problem with the nations being incorporated in Christ. And what God is doing through Christ, according to Paul, we get to Romans 11 through 15, where we see this narrative that Paul talks about God is reconciling the world. Okay. There's probably a half a dozen verses that he's alluding to this kind of narrative that's introduced. Colossians 1, 20 through 21, it was pleased that God dwelt in Christ through him to reconcile all things to himself, things on earth, things in heaven, making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So people don't realize, apart from ruling over Israel under unique covenant terms, God, the idea of God, the concept of God is that he rules all nations. All things belong to him. And so sometimes we get lost in the myopic nature of his role with Israel. But according to Deuteronomy 10:14, to the Lord your God belong the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth and everything in it. Psalm 22:28, for dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over all the nations. Psalm 47, 7 through 8, God is the king over all the earth. Sing ye praises with understanding. God reigneth over all the heathen. God sitteth upon the throne of his holiness. And even in Zechariah, there's this notion that one day God would be king, not just of Israel, over all the earth. That's Zechariah 14:9. So Israel-only proponents argue the Bible is only about Israel and Israel's story, but they fail to recognize within Israel's story contains history. The history of creation, the origin of the nations, the creation and history of Israel. So you can argue the Bible is Israel-centric, but not Israel only. And so people have this misunderstanding, like IO, they would say, well, it's all Israel, soup to nuts, and from Genesis to Revelation. But you have to keep in mind, when they're creating their history, they're integrating ancient tradition, ancient old tradition. So they actually are drawing from accounts of this idea of creation and this first man, the first sort of covenant man, Noah and the flood. Israel didn't create kind of the kernels within these stories. You can find similar accounts of these stories in the ancient Near East. So it's actually a misnomer. It's not Israel only. It may be infused with Israel sort of ideas and concept drawn from Israel. But nonetheless, I want to point out that when Genesis describes the origin of the nations through Noah after the flood, Jews take that seriously. I mean, first century Jews, their idea of history is going to be drawn from their religious texts. Our concept of history and creation and all that, and the nations, geography, is completely different. So just keep that in mind. So before Yahweh's covenant with Israel, God made a covenant with Noah and his seed. God gave them the same covenant mandate as he'd given Adam, to be fruitful, to increase and rule over the beasts, birds, and creeping things. Israel's origin story for the nations begins with Noah and his seed. The first reference to Gentiles, or goy, ethnos, in the Bible comes from Genesis 10 with the nations of Noah. As the story goes, the nations of Noah rebelled against God. They were judged with Babel, confusion, dispersed, and the covenant world was once again empty and void. Then God calls Abraham and Israel out of the dust among the rebellious and pagan nations and made a unique covenant with them, giving Israel a unique law code, establishing a house for God's name and his presence, etc. God called Israel out of those nations that once knew God in covenant as a firstborn and intended them to be a kingdom of priests, which I already alluded to, I believe is tied to Genesis 12, 1-3, where God would make Abraham great and through his seed would serve as a blessing to the nations. But you fast forward to the New Testament, the mystery of the gospel, according to Paul, had been already presented to Abraham. I think he says that in Romans. The idea that Abraham was presented with the gospel, right? In that the blessing of Abraham would include the nations as equal inheritors of justification and righteousness as sons of God, according to the new covenant promises through Israel's Messiah. So this is fulfilling God's expanded mission to reconcile the world, things in heaven and earth, back to himself. Now, Luke, as he takes on the book of Acts, he actually is taking his audience back to Genesis as he begins to explore this theme of God reconciling the world. So it's not just Paul. He's kind of introducing this motif of reversing the story of Babel and bringing all nations back to himself. So in essence, God is recreating the covenant world. He's going to form a new Adam, who is the last Adam, who is Christ, along with his seed, which would include all nations, and creating from all nations the world of Israel and the table of nations, creating one new covenant man. So in Babel, God divided the nations, changed their language. God begins to unite the nations of Shem, which included the nation of Israel, the nations of Ham, the nations of Japheth. Through the Spirit of God is now reorienting all the nations. They're reorienting their language by the Spirit. So all can worship God and build for God a new temple, which is the spiritual temple through Christ. So neither Luke or Paul is focused on Israel only. They're interested in peeling back the covenant onion even further with Adam and Genesis. This is Jackson Richardson. So he has a 60-page thesis paper. I suggest everyone read it. It's called Genesis 10 and 11, a theological and geographical framework for the mission of Paul. So he points out in Acts 2, 1-8, 25, details the mission of the church to the descendants of Shem as the gospel is preached in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, which includes deportees from the Mesopotamian nations. Acts 8, 26-40, then shifts and indicating the mission to the church to the descendants of Ham, which we have that a narrative with Philip, sharing the gospel with the Ethiopian eunuch from the territory of Cush. Then transitioning Luke into Acts 9 throughout the rest of the book, he's following Paul's missionary activities, detailing his mission to the church, those that say the descendants of Japheth. The geographical paradigm set for the mission of the church to the nations in Acts offers a sense of territoriality for Paul's missionary work, focusing on the sons of Japheth. So you can see that kind of storyline in reconciling the nations, even with Luke. So Paul, he actually draws from this storyline in Acts 17. So mind you, Paul, when he appeals to those of Areopagus, which was a prominent place of philosophical discourse, he doesn't appeal to them as Israelites, doesn't say men of Israel or brethren or stock of Abraham, but he says in Acts 17:22, men, Athenians, in all I perceive you as religious, and then he begins to reason with them by appealing to two pagan poets. And notice in that whole segment there in Acts 17, there's not one mention of the Old Testament. In other words, this is supposed to be this amazing sort of glorious event bringing back Israel. But for some reason, Paul never mentions that they're Israelites. He never quotes Jeremiah 31 or Ezekiel 34 or Jeremiah 33, 23. I can go on. But notice what he does is he actually appeals to natural theology and creation. So it's interesting. In Romans chapter 1, in Acts 14, to those among Asia, with all the pagans and the worshipers of Jupiter, as well as in this account, he appeals to creation. If these are sort of Israelites, you would think that Paul would say, hey guys, listen up, man. This is everything that the prophet said. You guys are excited, should be excited. This is a new covenant. This has been predicted and promised. You're being regathered. But anyway, Paul doesn't do that. So in Acts 17:24, he says, the God who made the world and everything in it. Again, appealing to creation. From one blood, every nation of men to dwell upon the face of the earth, having ordained times before appointed, and the bounds of their dwelling. The Greek word for bounds is Horatia, which is in a compound, the Greek word Orion. So that's used in Deuteronomy 32:8 in the Septuagint. So where it says that he fixed the borders, or in the Greek Septuagint, Orion of the peoples. So in Deuteronomy 32:8-9, it says, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided the sons of Adam, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But to the Lord's portion, right, is his people Jacob, his allotted heritage. But the idea of dividing the sons of Adam, fixing their borders, that's from Genesis 10, okay? So in Genesis 10, we see that in verse 5, these were the isles of the nations divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families in their nations. This idea of dividing in their nations. In verse 20, talks the same thing about the sons of Ham. 31, when discussing Shem. And 32, he says, these are the families of the sons of Noah, after their generations, in their nations. By these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So the reason why I'm bringing up Acts 17 is obvious that they're not Israelites, but that he's not appealing to their Israelite heritage. He's appealing to creation. He's appealing to the fact that these are the nations that God is calling in, which would be basically non-Abrahamic nations, right? It's the seed of Abraham that would bless the family, all the families of the earth. So I wanted to just point that out. As a side note, when you read Genesis 9, 26 and 27, it says, God blesses Shem, God shall enlarge Japheth, he shall dwell in the tents of Shem. So that was a promise, and we have many rabbinic writers. This is Jonathan ben Uziel in the first century. He's a Mishnah sage. So his idea of commentary here is that dwelling in the tents refers to the sons of Japheth enjoining themselves to the God of Israel, when he stated, and his children shall be proselytes and dwell in the school of Shem. So anyway, this idea of what does it mean God will enlarge Japheth and then dwell in the tents of Shem? And certain rabbinic scholars saw that as conversion through Israel. So God's reconciliation mission through Christ expanded well just beyond the land of Canaan and the nation of Israel, but also to non-Jewish nations, which Paul would have understood at least the framework tied to Genesis 10. Okay, so we have two people groups that could be traced back to a covenant with Yahweh. Both people groups in sin and darkness, both groups being reconciled to God through Christ in fulfillment of God, reconciling to himself all things. And so we understand, okay, I wanted to get into briefly, time's running out. The idea for the first century Jews, they understood what I'm explaining. And I have a whole host of quotes that I'm not going to quote all of them. But I want to point out, according to Romans 1, when Paul's addressing those believers of Rome, which would have included Jews and non-Jews, he is using a framework from the Genesis account, dealing with the sons of Adam and the sons of Noah. How would God judge people in rebellion? And so when you look at Paul in Romans chapter 1, the same language that he's using is found in, say, the Wisdom of Solomon. I'll just quote a few things from there, but this is the Testament of Naphtali, so written about the same time of Paul. So it says the Gentile nations, because they wandered astray and forsook the Lord, have changed the order and devoted themselves to stones and sticks, patterning themselves after wandering spirits. But you, my children, this is Naphtali allegedly speaking, shall not be like that. In the firmament, in the earth, and in the sea, and all the products of the workmanship, discern the Lord who made all things, so that you don't become like Sodom, which departed from the order of nature. So in this segment, you see similar elements you find in Romans chapter 1. The Gentiles, although they knew God, forsook the Lord. They turned from the order of God and turned to idolatry. They failed to discern God through creation. The phrase departed from the order of nature relates to the practice of same-sex relations, which Romans 1 touches on. And we can read about the judgment and wrath, the water to Sodom, in Genesis. And many scholars do see a connection between Romans 1 and Wisdom of Solomon 13 through 14. Wisdom of Solomon has amazing parallels. This is chapter 13. The people who were ignorant, they were foolish by nature. They didn't recognize the God of creation. They were miserable. They made things with their hands out of gold and fashioned them like animals. He formed them in the likeness of human beings. So you got to read Wisdom of Solomon 13 through 14. Jubilees 16, 5 through 6. You see the same narrative of the nations. It even calls them wicked and sinners. So the idea of Israel only sinning, that's not that would not have been an understanding in first century Judaism. I have, probably 6 to 8 different quotes just connecting nations and sin before God. And this is largely for people who can review this tape later, so you can look at these accounts. So this is Philo on Abraham, XXVI 136 through 137. You could review that. Goes to the same narrative. Josephus, chapter 11, verse 1. You can look into that. So I'm just trying to move forward here. Okay, so when we read in Acts 9:15, Paul is called to Israel and the nations, right? The Lord said to Ananias, "Go, this man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the nations and their kings and to the people of Israel. I will show him how he must suffer for my name." So you correlate that with Acts 26, 15 through 20, because I'm sure that's going to come up. So I'm glad I can address this. But so Paul is called by God to go to Israel and the nations. For some reason, IO thinks these are all Israelites, but I wanted to see point something out in Acts 26, kind of playing off the same narrative. In verse 15 through 20, where it says, "I'm Jesus whom you persecuting. Get up. I've appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and witness." I'm just paraphrasing. "I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I am sending you to them to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness and sin and place those who are sanctified in me." So it's interesting. Who are the Gentiles that Paul was delivered from? Because that's an indicator of who the Gentiles are. Because God is saying, you're going to them to preach the gospel. Now, we have accounts in Acts 17, 1 through 10, with the degenerate mob, right, with Paul, that Paul was delivered from. Those included non-Israelites. You can read that account. Acts 19, 23 through 41. It's the riot with the silversmith Demetrius. And the whole city was in uproar. And because they thought Paul was speaking out against the Greek goddess Artemis. So you have all these Artemis lovers, and they're coming out in an uproar against Paul. And so Paul's delivered from that. In Acts 22, 24, Paul was in Roman custody, taken to barracks and flogged, because the Jews presented Paul in custody. But he set him free, right? Claudius Lysias was the Roman captain. Now they reapprehended Paul because Jews again went to kill Paul. Paul also went to stand trial before Nero. He spent 2 years preaching the gospel to the nations. This is Acts 28:28. Early Christian writings say from Clement suggest that Paul was set free after his first trial in Rome. The point of that is to show that he wasn't delivered from the 10 tribes. He was delivered from non-Israelite nations, and it was to them that he was preaching the gospel to. So I'll continue. In Romans 15:8, Paul says that Christ has become a servant to circumcision so that the promises to the patriarchs might be confirmed, and moreover, the nations might glorify God. And as it is written, therefore, I'll praise you among the nations. I will sing praises of your name. Paul's quoting from Psalm 18:48 through 49. The nations there are non-Israelites. You can just look at that for yourself. This is interesting. In Isaiah 49, 5 through 6, Paul sees himself as the servant of the Lord, bringing light and salvation to the Gentiles. So in Isaiah 49, 5 through 6, it says, and now saith the Lord that formed me from the womb, right? He says, I will give you light to the nations, that thou mayest be my salvation to the end of the earth. What's interesting, Galatians 1, 15 through 16, Paul is aligning himself with Isaiah 49 when he says, whose God set me apart from my mother's womb by his grace, that I might preach among the nations. And so clearly, if you look at Isaiah 49, 5 through 6, that whole narrative is distinguishing Israel from the nations, which means if Paul is believing he's fulfilling that ministry, then he's not going to Israelites. He's going to the non-Israelite nations. I alluded to Jacob, almost done. Jacob Richardson states, who I alluded to earlier, when Paul describes himself and his calling as the apostle to the nations, he envisions himself as participating in the eschatological restoration narrative that begins with the promise to Abraham in the wake of Babel, facilitating the blessing that is to come to all the earth. Paul believes his work as an apostle to the Gentiles is integral in bringing in the full number of nations that will allow for the salvation of all Israel and the second coming of Christ to take place. And we can look at Acts 13. If people want to know who the Gentiles are, well, we can look in Acts 13, and it definitely wasn't the children. They definitely weren't the 10 tribes of Israel. In Acts 13, 16 through 26, you see this clear distinction. Paul stood up, beckoning with his hand. You have men of Israel, and ye that fear God. That's verse 16. He goes on to say in verse 26, men of Israel, the children of the stock of Abraham, and whosoever among you feareth God. To you this word of salvation has been sent. He goes on to say in verses 46 to 48, Paul answered them, we spoke the word of God to you first. That would have been the Jew, those among Israel. Since you reject it and do not consider yourselves worthy of eternal life, we now turn to the Gentiles. For this is what the Lord has commanded. I made you a light to the nations. You may bring salvation to the ends of the earth. And I'm going to go over a few more passages and I'll wrap it up. But I want to highlight something here, which is that when Paul, his ministry, he never claims he's going to find the lost sheep. He never claims Israel is the nations or nations are Israel. And it's interesting, if you look at his itinerant ministry, so the tradition in the first century was that the 10 tribes were beyond the Euphrates. You find this in Josephus. He says that there were no 10 tribes in Asia or Rome, and they were in Assyria, which is where they were taken captive and assimilated in 720 BC. Now, Second Esdras reiterates that as another Jewish author from around first, second century, but he reiterates that and says, yeah, they're beyond the Euphrates, but they're in a mystical place awaiting the eschaton. So I want to make it known that Paul's itinerant ministry, he didn't go northeast looking for Israelites. He actually went to where there's large Jewish communities, where there were Jewish synagogues. Now, these synagogues and Jewish communities are among the larger Gentile nations. The larger Gentile nations are actually enjoining themselves to these Jewish communities, to the synagogues. We have no record in the first century of any among the 10 tribes gathering with Jews to go to Jewish synagogues. I.O. is famously, loves to point out that the tension and division was between Jews and the 10 tribes in the first century. If there was tension between Jews and the 10 tribes in the first century, why are they going to Jewish synagogues? And more importantly, when Paul's talking about ye who fear God, they're tied to the proselyte community and the God-fearers, who were simply just non-Jews, right? And there's a faction of proselytes called the proselyte of righteousness, who were circumcised, who fought, they were Jews in every way except by blood. And even among the Jews, some of them considered to be Jews. So the whole concept and term Jew had evolved in the first century. In Josephus, when he talks about the king, I think it's King Isrates. You could look into that. But he refers to him as a Jew. He refers to the Idumeans who converted under John Hyrcanus as Jews. So Jew was not, it evolved from the tribe of Judah to the southern kingdom, to representing the nation, to a kind of social and religious construct or a religious system in the first century, where you have certain proselytes who were among them as Jews. The God-fearers, they were distinct, and I'll get into that a little later. But the bottom line is, those who feared God, those who were among the Jewish communities, they were of the nations. The term nation, the ethnos or the ethnesian in the Greek, you can look in the Apocrypha. There's actually a concordance. There is zero record of any Jew referring to the 10 tribes as the ethnos or the ethnesian. And that's telling. And in every case, when you go look at, say, a concordance for just the term, mostly it uses Gentile, sometimes nation, it's always referring to non-Jewish nations, never to the 10 tribes. And so to a first century Jew, if you have a bifurcated model of Jew and Gentile, or Jew and ethnos, it's going to be Jew and non-Jew. Stop. There's no disclaimer or subset like, yeah, it's Jew and the ethnos, but really it's the 10 tribes among them. And no. It's Josephus has a kind of trifurcated model, and he appeals to Jews, Greeks, and barbarians. And so I'm going to get into that a little bit later for the lack of time. Okay, go real quick. I'm almost done. 5 more minutes. Just to show that the Old Testament, which Israel only loves to point to, to say that the New Testament is completely grounded in the Old Testament, and it's all about Israel. But when it speaks about Israel's restoration, it always includes the nations. Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2, it'll come past in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established, and the top of the mountain shall be exalted above the hills. All nations shall flow to it. We all know Daniel. I hope I get into this, but Daniel's whole eschatology, which the New Testament is drawing from, New Testament draws from Daniel. It quotes, echoes, or alludes probably, some say upwards of 100 times. Paul does it probably 10 to 12 times. So if you want to know where Paul and the New Testament drawing their eschatology from, they're believing that they're fulfilling the prophetic words of Daniel. And according to Daniel, you have Daniel 7, Daniel 2, 7, in which the nations that were under the four beasts, right? For Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, from a first century point of view, because there's different opinions on Daniel. The point is that the power that those beasts had were not just over Israel. The power that they had are being transferred to the Son of Man and to the saints. That's New Testament eschatology. So Daniel 7, In a vision I looked, therefore one before me, the Son of Man, coming on clouds. He approached the Ancient of Days, led in his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is everlasting dominion, will not pass away. His kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Psalms chapter 22, 27 through 28. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nations will bow down before him, for dominion belongs to the Lord. Isaiah 52, 13 through 15. You can even tie this to the messianic suffering servant, where in 52, 13 through 15, you have this servant highly extolled, and his vision is marred. And it says, he will sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths at him. What's interesting is the word sprinkle is the same one we find in Leviticus 16:14, which speaks of the sacrificial blood being sprinkled on a mercy seat. And clearly the point is that expands beyond simply the nation of Israel. Zechariah 2, 10 through 11. Some of these texts do have allusions to coming out of Babylon, which is fine by me, because it just proves that part of Israel's restoration would include the nations. Zechariah 2, 10 through 11. Shout and be glad, daughter Zion, I'm coming. I will live among you. Many nations will be joined to the Lord in that day and will become my people. Isaiah 66 through 23, verse 23. I really can't wait to get into Revelation 21, 22, and how it ties in Isaiah 65 and 66. But nonetheless, you have in Isaiah 66, 23, from one new moon to another, from one Sabbath to another, all mankind will come to worship before me. Read the same thing, Micah 4, 1 through 2. You can go through that on your own. Paul understood that every knee was to bow in heaven and earth, under heaven. Every tongue would confess that Jesus is Lord. I didn't get into Isaiah 19. That talks about Egyptians, Assyrians worshiping together with Israelites. It has this remarkable covenantal language. It says, I will make himself known to Egyptians. They will worship with sacrifices and grain offerings. They'll make vows to the Lord and keep them. So in that day, there'll be a highway, and basically it's kind of speaking about the Messianic age. You can read that in Isaiah 19. One last point, and I promise we'll be done. And in Acts 15, James alludes to the restoration of the tent of David. So you can look into that in Amos chapter 9. The reason why Paul understands and this idea of the Son of Man ruling the nations actually is tied to the Davidic promises themselves. So if you're talking about restoring the tent of David, what you're actually doing is saying that Christ is going, because if you read in Amos 9, it talks about how God will restore the tents of David, and all mankind and all nations will come to the Lord, which is astonishing. But the point is that the Davidic promise was that this Messiah it would rule from Jerusalem and Zion, but it would bring peace to the nations of the world. So that's not in Io's bag. That's in our bag. And you can read that in Acts 15 and Amos chapter 9. I'll leave it there, brother. I just wanted to focus on the Old Testament and New Testament. And if I can, Tristan, before we get into Q&A, I just want to make it known that I'm not here to defend full preterism. I'm a full preterist, but that's for a different discussion. So I'm going to freely pass on any question I don't think is relevant, that hasn't touched on this information, nor is it tied to IO. Right? I'm not going to have someone like, I love Lance Connolly. Hey, what about the resurrection? Or what about, in other words, the epistemology of it all? That's not what I'm focusing on. So if someone has a question related to IO, my beliefs are going to intersect. But anyway, I wanted to at least offer some food for thought from the Old and New Testament, and let the games begin. Thank you. Appreciate everyone for letting me share.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you, Mike. There's been a lot of interesting statements that have been made in the comment section. And Mike, I want to tell you how much I respect you as a full preterist representative. You are someone who's daring, someone who's taken on challenges, which I believe there are other full preterist voices that have not attempted to tackle this teaching. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and go to Q&A. And again, the viewers, I apologize for the lag on my end. I have done everything I could to get some internet connection that can somehow flow with this. It's hit and miss. I had an interview earlier with the full preterist, no problems, but right now there is a lag, as I can see. So I apologize for that. I
I do
will
like
get
the
this squared
background
away.
change, though, Tristan.
Oh, okay. You don't like the black curtain in the background. I remember.
Yeah, no, this
That's
is much
funny.
more appealing.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so without further ado, again, everybody, I do apologize for the lag on my end, but however, the sound quality is great, and eventually, soon I will get this squared away with. I don't know what kind of heaps and hurdles I got to do, but anyways, let's go ahead and get this squared away with. All right, you guys, Q&A. Mike, before I ask these questions, if I may kindly request that we try to keep the answers maybe 30 seconds to a minute, short and concise. The reason why I ask this is because I have over 20 questions, okay? Emailed to me, messaged from me on Facebook Messenger. I've even have some new ones here on the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and get on with the very first one. It's coming from Sun Power Solar. I'm going to go ahead and present it right now so that everybody can see. And again, we'll go ahead and keep it 30 seconds to a minute, and I'll go ahead and stop you if it goes over a minute. Sun Power Solar. Who are those like the sand in the seashore, which cannot be numbered?
Oh, I thought that was. Go ahead. I thought I was reading the screen. It was a different question. Okay.
Okay.
Who are those like the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered? Well, that would be an allusion to Israel.
Okay. Do you want to further expound on that?
No, I mean, I wish there was a point attached to the question, but no, I have nothing more I could say about that.
Okay. All right. I think with the IOers, they're going to try to say that those in the sand and the seashore that cannot be numbered were all Israelites, and it was exclusively for Israel. I think that's what Sun Power Solar is trying to say. Would you like to comment on the exclusivity factor that the gathering?
No, I got to look at a particular text, so that really doesn't help.
Okay. All righty.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Okay.
the Old Testament, Israel would be like the sand of the sea, so I agree.
Okay. All righty. Let me go ahead and go to Caleb's. Caleb, who is a IO representative, I had him on my podcast. Very articulate gentleman. He says this: since you claim to be saved today and in the kingdom, yet we're never under the Mosaic law, is it a universal law you are saved from in regards to sin? If so, how are you able to be saved from a moral law related curse when the Bible focus and emphasis is redemption on those under the curse of the Mosaic law per Galatians 4, etc.
Yeah, I'm going to just address the Israel only. Again, I'm going to pass on anything that's related to what my views are in relation to full preterism. So basically, what I can gather from the point of view for IO is that Christ only came to redeem those under the curse or under Mosaic law. Well, that's a fallacy. That's not true. So in Romans chapter 2, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and actually Acts 15. So I'll go through these texts. Paul doesn't argue. Now, there were, like I said, there were the idea that the proselytes of righteousness were under the law. So people don't realize the nuances in some of this history. But by and large, when you get to Romans written about 58, 60 AD, you're going to have a lot of the ethnos that were never introduced to the law of Moses. And what Paul does there is he says, yeah, no, they weren't under the law. And they actually sinned apart from the law. And so they had a law unto themselves, Paul says, a law by nature. In 1 Corinthians 9, when Paul says, I speak to those under the law, and he also speaks to those who were not under the law. So I don't agree that everyone that is participating participating in Christ was under the law. In Acts 15, just want to read this real quick.
Okay.
So when Peter rises up, and let me see where that quote is. Bear with me.
Again, we'll try to keep it about a minute for each question. That way I can get to everyone's question.
I'll wrap it up with this. Okay. Peter says about the ethnos, or the nations, why do you tempt God to put a yoke upon the neck of the disciples that neither we or our forefathers were able to bear? So, wait a second. I thought the nations were Israelites who were at one time under the law. So why are you saying that, yeah, let's not put a yoke that either was put on us or our forefathers? So the point is that there are two soteriological streams going on, and there were those under Moses and those who were not under Moses. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. All righty. Let me go ahead and present. This question may be pretty long because I do have, like I said, about 20 questions. So thank you for making that one, pretty short and concise. But this one has a 3-part question. So here it goes. Okay. Please tell us, and the P is cut off here. Please tell us when Christ came for his saints at the end and the dead ones rose, the ones who Paul said would rise first, and then the living would follow. Can you tell us where those ones who are left behind would exist on earth? Why don't any of the apostles of the last days include any instructions or tips for those who supposedly were left behind? And let me go ahead and get to the last portion of this discussion. I think that was it. Okay, so if I could just summarize the gist of this. Look, we have this last portion right here. The dead ones went. Did those dead ones inherit a place called heaven? If the answer is yes, then how do we know when to interpret heaven as a literal place of inheritance or the state? Okay, so if I could summarize this question, I guess if the full preterists are saying that the dead ones in Hades were somehow taken up, they had a change, and they went up into heaven, what happened to the living saints who were left behind? And this person is asking, why didn't Paul give it any instructions on the church to those that were left behind? Like after 70 AD, here is how the church will conduct itself.
Yeah. So I don't accept the premise that those, so in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, there would be those who were alive and remaining when Christ returned. And the idea of the parousia and apontesis, I don't know why someone from Israel would draw from 18th, 19th century dispensationalism. I don't believe in the rapture. But let me at least offer this particular quote. Maybe this will help. Bear with me.
Now, by apontesis, are you by apontesis? I just want to clarify, just for the question. By apontesis, you're talking about when the saints were to meet Christ and then escort him back down to the earth, correct?
Well, my particular view is that Paul is trying to encourage believers, and usually when you're appealing to apocalyptic language, it doesn't necessarily mean you take that hyperliterally. So usually apocalyptic language and imagery is meant to represent theology. And the theology represented there is like, guys, don't be discouraged. You're going to receive your inheritance. And the idea of meeting the Lord in the air is simply the air that governed, or the realm that governed over the earth, which is a testament to the fact that they would receive their inheritance to rule the nations. If you remember, Satan ruled the power of the air, and he worked in the sons of disobedience. Satan didn't have to be in sort of any biological form, and he didn't have to literally come down to work in the sons of disobedience. So the idea of, not just for Jewish thought, but even some Greco-Roman thought, is that heaven had different layers. And, this particular layer of the air is where there was, I guess, spiritual dimension that ruled or governed over the earth. The idea is that Satan and his followers, right, would be kicked out, which would be tied to, religious and political establishment. John chapter 8, the sons of the devil were those who rejected Christ amongst the Jews. And so, I don't take that to be hyper literally, and even some non-full preterists don't either. So let me just, because we can't take
and again, that question, I want to give credit to the question. It was coming from Charlie Patterson. He's very active in the Simple Preterist group. I'm sure you know who he is. He's been very active in the Simple Preterist group. That question came from him, and he does have a series of questions.
Let me wrap that question up. So this is a prominent scholar, N.T. Wright. He's not a full preterist. So this is what he argued or talked about in his article on the rapture. Paul borrows imagery from biblical and political sources to enhance his message. Little did he know how his rich metaphors would be understood 2 millennia later. So first, Paul echoes the story of Moses coming down with the mountain with Torah. The trumpet sounds, a loud voice is heard. After a long wait, Moses comes to see what's going on in his absence. Second, he believes he's echoing Daniel 7, in which the saints of the Most High are vindicated over their pagan enemy by being raised to sit with God in glory. This metaphor applied to Jesus in the Gospels is now applied to Christians who are suffering. Third, Paul conjures up images of an emperor visiting a colony or province. The citizens go out to meet him in an open country and escort him into the city. Paul's image of people meeting the Lord in the air should be read with the assumption that people will immediately turn around and lead the Lord back to this kind of newly remade world. Paul's mixed metaphors of trumpets and blowing and living being snatched from heaven to meet the Lord in the air should not be understood as literal truth, as the Left Behind series suggests, but a vivid and biblically elusive description of a great transformation of the present world of which he speaks elsewhere. Full preterist Michael Sullivan says this: when a picture of the rapture is that Christ came down from heaven in on a cloud to earth, where he gathered the living into his presence within us, where we function as his most holy place, the dwelling place, and throne through which he rules the nations. This actually fits with Thessalonians. I forget where, when Christ returns, he'll be glorified in the saints. But anyway, he says this is what also we see in Revelation, where the New Jerusalem comes down from heaven, and God establishes his presence within his church. And 10 more seconds. The way Paul speaks, people don't realize that Paul already said that the saints were raised. He said it probably 3 times. You're seated with Christ in the heavenlies. You've been raised with Christ. He talks about it in 1 Thessalonians, I think it's 5. He says when the guy had sex with his father's wife, we're being gathered with my spirit and the power of the Lord Jesus. So I think people don't realize the kind of deeper level. Paul would always say, like in Corinthians, he's explaining spiritual truths with spiritual words.
Right.
And so not everything is meant to be.
Again, Mike, we got to keep every question around 1 minute. I want to give you your liberty, but I do want to be able to have those in the chat, voice themselves.
Let's go.
Because I know what it's like to be in the chat. Perfect. Again, I just want to keep it. But Charlie Patterson is asking. He's saying, Tristan, please make sure he tells us where the dead ones went when Christ returned, and if they received heaven. How do we know when to interpret heaven as a literal place or just metaphorical? I'll go ahead and say this one again. He wants me to emphasize this. Tristan, please make sure he tells us where the dead ones went when Christ returned.
Okay.
And if they received heaven, let me see the last portion. If they received heaven, how do we know when to interpret heaven as literal or metaphoric?
Yeah. So, Tristan, I'm going to pass because, listen, I spent a good hour on presenting information against from Old and New Testament. I'm not going to describe what a full preterist believes about Hades and the resurrection. That's not this discussion. And it's kind of embarrassing that full preterist or that IO can't come in to defend themselves and deal with the topic at hand. Why do they think the Gentiles are Israelites? That's the question. Why do they think the Old Testament and New Testament is all about Israel only? So go ahead. Next question. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Let me go ahead and go on to his next question. Again, Charlie, that was Mike's question. Let me go ahead or his answer to that question. Let me go ahead and go to the next one. He says, Michael, in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he instructs them to almost give up on their marriages because the time was short. See as how you reject the last days ascension of the brethren at the coming of the firstborn. Can you give us a sensible answer as to why Paul would tell those far outside of the boundaries of the judgment of Jerusalem that they were married to live as though they were not married, and to sell their possessions, to regard them as nothing because the time was short? Now, let me go ahead and give a synopsis of this, because I'm copying and pasting what they're emailing me. And I guess what they're saying, and Mark Smith and I actually had a discussion on this yesterday, those living hundreds of miles away from the temple, Mark Smith, who debated on Myth Vision, he had stated, well, why is Paul telling them not to get married when the time is short? What would be the indication of that if they had nothing to do with the judgment of Jerusalem in 70 AD, because they're hundreds of miles away? What would be your response?
Tristan, you killing me. I guess they've conceded that IO is trash because they're not really addressing IO. But my take is, and let me read you a quote. This is the Histories of Tacitus, Volume 2, Chapter 2. The history in which I'm entering into is a period rich in disasters, terrible with battles, torn by civil struggles, horrible even in peace. 4 emperors fell, 3 civil wars, foreign wars. The condition of the Roman state was almost at its last until Vespasian came in. The basic reality is they're drawing from Daniel. Daniel is highlighting this kind of judgment against the beast and the little horn. And the whole idea in the first century is God is shaking the nations. In Luke 21, it's not just nation against nation of Israel. He's dealing with a larger, broader scope. Now, the apostles don't have all the details, but when Paul says there's going to be distress for both Greek, he's in Rome, distress for Greek and Jew. The reality is he understood there was a shaking going to happen. And whether it's Corinth or anywhere in the empire, the reality is that both the world of Israel and the world of Rome went through distress, trial, and trouble. And believers were persecuted not just in Judea, but also throughout Rome and other provinces of Roman Empire as well. So there was political ramifications, there was economic, and again, the idea, like in Isaiah 19, and I'll land with this because God says He judged Isaiah. He judged in Isaiah. He judged Egypt by them fighting against each other. All I can say is the Roman world and the world of Israel fell into civil war, and it caused upheavals and tension and distress. And Paul didn't have all the details, but he had an idea based on Old Testament text that there would be some, obviously, distress amongst all the nations. But anyway, go ahead.
Okay. Let me go ahead and go to another question here. It looks like some of those in the chat are pretty much saying, Mike, that you are not, I'm just trying to be fair to both parties, that you're not answering the question about the marriages that were in distance. Some are saying that you're suggesting this has nothing to do with IO. I think, Mike, when we talk about IO, there's 2 sides. We have the Gentile argument, and then we have the conclusive argument. So I guess this question highlights the conclusive argument, and some in the chat are complaining about some of your answers. But so do you want to add on to that, or would you rather have me go on to the next question?
No, it's actually a fair question, but I think I addressed it. Paul understood that all the nations would go through there would be some distress that affected the Roman world and the world of Israel. He doesn't have all the details, but he's preparing his believers. And listen, focus on the kingdom, because he knew the eschaton was set in that time of distress, which you can read about in Tacitus and Josephus. The Roman world and the world of Israel went under distress and in civil war. So that would be my response.
Okay. Let me go ahead and again, I'm just copying and pasting these questions. So I'm going to go ahead and present them in the sequential order. So we have another one, Romans 11. Our argument is that Paul's fullness of the Gentiles that he is seeking to complete the mission for all Israel to be saved are the same ones Jesus referred to. I have come for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. They are come for the ones that Caiaphas refers to here. He died not only for the nation, but also for the sons of God scattered abroad. They are also the same ones that John writes to, where he died only for our sins, but for the sins of the whole world. Mike, explain to us, remember how Jesus said he wouldn't lose one of his sheep, why we shouldn't understand the fullness of nations to mean he was gathering every last one of the sheep to complete the mission for his people. So let me go ahead and, if I could summarize this. If we read in John 11 and we read that Jesus said he came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, that the fullness of the Gentiles, that full number of both Jew and Gentiles was supposed to result in all of Israel being saved. So the latter portion of this question is the fullness of nations to mean he's gathering every last one of his lost sheep. So this seems to be both the Gentile and the conclusive argument. So what would you say in response to that?
I'd say he's committing contextonomy to fallacy. He's cherry picking. The context of Paul has nothing to do. Paul was an apostle to the nations. Jesus and the original apostles were sent for the lost sheep. Paul alludes to this nation, Israel nation, Jew, Greek distinction 30 times in his writings. I don't know why they're conflating the nations as being Israelites, because they're not. So that's the first problem. So I don't have an issue with the gathering of the lost sheep. It just wasn't Paul's ministry. The fullness of the nations in Romans 11, and I've looked into this, reality is it has no connection to Genesis 48. And I'll explain just real briefly. The idea of Palermo in Romans 11 is used for Israel. You can read that in verse 12. Now, if the fall of them, Israel, be the riches of the world, diminishing in the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? So the fullness is used for Israel and the nations. What's the fullness of? What are the Gentiles what is the fullness of the Gentiles coming in? They're being grafted into the tree. That's all that means. So the fullness of Israel is when their fullness is grafted into the tree. And the nations would be grafted into the tree. It has nothing to do with being made into a multitude of nations. So I don't see the connection there. Some may, but it's used for both Israel and the nations, and both are coming into the tree. And there would become a time when all Israel would be saved, which I do believe was 70 AD.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and move on to another question from somebody else. Charlie, I know you have another one that you sent to me, but it was typed very long, and it's hard for me to copy and paste it here on the chat. But I will try to get to that third one that you had. I gave you 3, and I'm trying to reduce each one to 3 questions. So Charlie, if you want to go ahead and type in the question in the live chat, something that you have, something that's kind of concise, because some of the questions that you email were pretty long, and when I try to copy and paste them, they're coming out just a little bit too long. But here's one from George Burdell. Mike, I don't know if you notice who this person is. I don't know who this person is. I'm thinking it's somebody else. I mean, I don't know. There's people who have alias. Okay. If
Hey, Morgan.
it is Michael Bradley, that's what.
Oh, is it
Okay.
Michael?
Then this question is, Okay, if this is whoever it is, I don't know. I'm not making any statements here. I'm just saying that this person seems to be very, very incisive on the IO doctrine. So here it goes. Here is his first question. And again, those of you that are viewing, I apologize for this lag. Like I said, I've paid for high-speed internet. Like I'm paying $124. I'm living up in the hills. And so I guess it's the connection, but I will get this solved as soon as possible. So I do apologize for these eyesores on my end. Hopefully it's not too bad, but the audio quality is pretty good. Okay, so here he goes. Number one, Michael Karras, you accuse IO of committing the illegitimate totality transfer fallacy when we show how Paul quoted from the Old Testament to identify some Gentiles as the descendants of the tribes of Israel. Don't you commit that same fallacy every time you claim that Paul quoted from Philo because Paul used the similar words of Philo? Do you need me to repeat the question?
No, I'm trying to process it. Don't you commit the same fallacy every time because when you show Paul? No, I guess no. I mean, the answer is no. It's
Okay,
clear
let me go and read off the question
Paul
again.
was drawing from Philo. Okay, that's one point. But Paul,
I guess what
like,
he is, I guess what he is, yeah, I guess what he's saying is that, let me read off the question again. That way, everybody can say that they at least got their question across. Okay. Michael Karras, you accuse IO of committing illegitimate totality transfer fallacy when we show that Paul quoted from the Old Testament to identify some Gentiles as the descendants of Israel. Okay. So have you stated that before, Mike, that Israel only has committed illegitimate totality transfer when they quote from the Old Testament to identify the Gentiles?
yeah, this what was a connection to last time? Oh, like maybe one instance, right? When you have this idea that Israel was called an olive tree, right? And to then transfer that understanding to Paul's use of horticulture in reference to the nations as a wild olive tree. Yeah, I think it's it's a false equivocation. It's a fallacy.
Okay. So the
But
second part was, don't, he's saying, don't, do you commit the same fallacy every time you claim Paul quoted from Philo? Because he
no,
used similar
you,
words from Philo.
no, I think
Okay.
the interesting point to make is that Paul draws from many sources, right? I know he's quoting from Philo because they're literally some word for word. And so my conclusion there is based on not just Philo, but Jews had a particular mindset in the first century. Okay, when it comes to Adam, when it comes to sin, when it comes to the nations. So I don't base my understanding of Paul solely from Philo, but that's it's a difficult question when he's not here because we'd have to go back and forth. But go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Here's the second part from the same person. Michael Karras, you claim that Paul was seeking to include descendants of the table of nations. Where in the New Testament is the term table of nations mentioned? If not mentioned, then what is your claim based on, if not mere presupposition?
Tristan, and I love you, brother. This is embarrassing. I presented an hour of information, and this is the best IO can do. My position is Paul is not seeking the table of nations. My position is Paul is a Jew. And I already reiterated that as a Jew, he considers the Torah as a context for theology and history. And so if he is, say, quoting Genesis 12:3, which, by the way, in Genesis 12:3, the idea of the Mizpah, or the families of the earth, the antecedent is Genesis 10. So Do I believe that Paul, as a Jew, took the account of, say, Noah and the origins of the nations as history? I likely I did. Right? They had their own world. It's not our world, but there's nothing wrong with that. And so the idea is that the first term Gentiles or nations are used, it's in Genesis 10. It's the first time it's used in the Bible. And so I do believe that Paul believed God reconciling the world. Even Luke is making the case, which I argued, is that God is reconciling the world. They would have known as the world of Israel and the nations around them, which would have been derived from Genesis 10. That's all. So
Okay. And again,
real quick,
go ahead.
I already explained that Paul was seeking non-Jews. To a Jew, the term ethnos, ethnician, never, by a Jew, it's never understood as a Jew in the 10 tribes. So if you're a Jew and you hear that bifurcated model of Jew and ethnos, it's simply a non-Jew, non-Jewish tribe, person, and nation. And real quick, in the Old Testament under national Israel, it was Israel and the Goy and Goyim. It's just flipped because in the first century, Jew represented Israel, right, for the most part. So that's the whole contrast, is Jew and non-Jew. Paul sought non-Jews, most of them who were understood about the world of Israel and Moses, because God-fearers and proselytes would have been familiar with that world. And that's where he went. So
okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, here's another one. Michael Karras, since the Hebrew word for nations, goy, is used to refer to descendants of Ephraim in the Old Testament, on what basis do you deny that the nations in the New Testament were not descendants of Ephraim?
Descendants of Ephraim in the Old Testament.
Since the Hebrew word for nations, goy, is used to refer to descendants of Ephraim in the Old Testament, on what basis do you deny that the nations in the New Testament were not descendants of Ephraim?
I don't know why they're not giving a scriptural quote. The 10 tribes were among the nations, right? In Hosea, they're swallowed up among the nations. And that's the terminology. The ethnos are not the nations. Israel is a nation. Yes, Goy and Goyim can be referenced to Israel. In John, the Judean nation was referred to as an ethnos. But the 10 tribes, they didn't have an ethnos in the first century. There were no 10 tribe communities or places of worship. They had no national identity. So you just wouldn't use that term. So I would say no. You could refer to Israel as a nation, or the ethnos, or Goy, but you can't. But the language is there among the nations, right? So real quick, in John 7 and Acts 21, it says the Jews among the nations. That's how it should be understood. Not the Jews are the nations, or the 10 tribes are the nations. So, and mind you, there's a term called, real quick, there's a term called historical revisionism. So this is a fallacy of IO, which is they have their own world, their own template, and they're forcing it into the New Testament template. It will never work, and they're revising the whole backdrop of first century Judaism. But go ahead, I can go off that tangent.
Okay, I just want to keep the questions around 1 minute, okay, because we do have a lot, and I just want to get through it. We're at the 1 hour and a half mark almost.
Okay.
Here's a bonus question coming from the same person. Thank you, Mike. According to Hebrews 8:8, Christ's new covenant was with Judah and Israel. Where are the non-Israelites in Christ's new covenant? If non-Israelites benefited from it in some way, don't you think it would be presented explicitly? I'll go ahead and read the question off again. According to Hebrews 8:8, Christ's new covenant was with Judah and Israel. Where are the non-Israelites in Christ's new covenant? If non-Israelites benefited from it in some way, don't you think it would be presented explicitly?
Actually, no. And that's the whole point, right? The whole point is that when Paul discusses the mystery of the nations being included in Christ, it's not detailed in the Old Testament, right? Now, I already explained, and this myopic sort of narrative of I.O. is that, yes, to Israel belongs the covenants, but it didn't mean others couldn't participate and join themselves with Israel and receive the blessings. The whole point, when you read Galatians and the way Paul says, he basically says, we've been redeemed so that, right? And he talks about, basically the way he frames it is, it's through Israel, who has received these promises and these covenants, that allows the nations to participate in the blessings of Christ. So that's it's just a myopic way of understanding the covenant. First of all, Hebrews is not written by Paul. You know, the author of Hebrews never mentions the Gentiles. He never mentions the Greeks. He's not an apostle to the Gentiles. Paul is. And so he's obviously, matter of fact, in Hebrews 8, it's not even about Judah and Israel. He's simply offering a precedent why there's a new covenant. So, but in all honesty, Hebrews is not even written to Gentiles. So it's when Paul speaks about the Gentiles, when Paul speaks about Gentile inclusion, he never quotes Jeremiah 31. He never quotes Ezekiel 37, Ezekiel 34, Jeremiah 23, Jeremiah 33. Why is that? If they're Israelites, why is he quoting Psalms in one chapter when he's predicating the Israelites? Or why is he just alluding to Abraham and the blessings that were promised through the seed of Israel? So I don't know. Israel only, that whole idea of it doesn't make sense. So you can have the covenant.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and
you could receive the blessing through Israel.
Okay. Okay, let's go ahead and go on to the next one. This is coming from Eastgate Adoptionist. He says, how is CBV any different than IO if they both are saying we don't repent of our old selves to die and resurrect in Christ after 70 AD? I'll go ahead and read it again. How is CBV, Covenant Body View, any different than IO if they both are saying we don't repent of our old selves to die and resurrect in Christ after 70 AD?
All right, so I don't know if the audience is listening or not, but this is not about what I believe regarding my views on full preterism. I will say this, because this hasn't been touched. There is no ambiguity with the New Testament authors. They believe, according to Mark 12, Mark 10, Matthew 12, Hebrews 6, that there was a coming age. Hebrews 2, there was a world, oikomene, he says, a new world to come, which oikomene always is related to the earth. They understood that to pray for the kingdom to come on earth as it was in heaven. The meek shall inherit the earth. There'll be a new heaven and earth. So my view is that these allude to a post-70 AD reality. The fact that John alludes to a new heaven and earth in Revelation 21 proves that that's related to heaven and earth. So I'm not here to answer, well, what do I believe about post-70 AD? I'm just here to say, disprove the idea that the IO in conclusiveness. The New Testament is in line with all the Jewish writings of their day, Jubilees, Enoch, the Essenes, and DSS. They all understood that there would be a renewed physical world, right? The New Testament has its own idea, but Revelation 21, when it's drawing from Isaiah 65, 66, that is relegated to the physical world. So I just wanted to make that point because that's in line with this discussion. What I believe about CBV, post 70 AD is irrelevant. Okay.
All right. Here's another one from Eastgate Adoptionist. Did Jesus stop returning through his saints in AD 70?
Did Jesus stop returning
through his saints? did Jesus stop returning through his saints in AD 70? What would you how would you respond to that, just based upon how you gather that question, that information?
No, it's nonsensical. You can go on.
Okay. Okay, let's see. This one is coming from. Okay, it looks like we got some more from the dead being raised. If the dead were raised up into heaven, what about the together factor? If they were together to meet Christ in the air and to forever be with the Lord, if we say as full preterists that they were caught up into heaven, then were the saints also caught up together into heaven as well?
Yeah, we touched on this earlier. So my view, I don't believe in a physical rapture, and the idea of the air is just the governing realm over the earth. Paul talks about meeting Christ on many occasions, which is not to be taken hyper literally, and the idea is just connoting fulfillment, that the church, those living and dead, would be united taken out of Moses and into Christ as the consummated bride. They're the ones who are governing the realm of the earth. And that's what Daniel says. So I don't believe in a physical rapture. I believe that from a covenantal point of view, predicated in the mind and the will of God, the church, Christ and the church are now they have the government of God. They're in covenant control. In Matthew 21, after the judgment, those who sat in the seat of Moses and that religious and political establishment, when they're judged, it says the right and privilege of the government or the kingdom would be taken from them and given it to the saints. So that's Daniel. And the point is when you look at Daniel 7:26, matter of fact, it won't take long. I'll just land with that, brother.
Okay.
It says, the judgment shall sit, they shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy it to the end. So obviously, this is after the judgment. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven. So if I was to ask, what does under heaven mean? Well, probably would be the earth. And it says that the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. All dominions shall serve and obey him. And so I've asked this to Io. In Revelation 11:15, it says, after the seventh trumpet, the kingdom of the world has become God and his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. You have the city coming down, which embodies government over the earth. The question is, and those prerogatives were given to the saints in Revelation 2:26, Revelation 5, Revelation 22, verse 3. The saints were to rule following the judgment. And in Revelation 22, where it says the saints shall rule forever and ever, the Greek word is it's aionios, it's intensified Greek for aeon. The bottom line is the saints would take the prerogative of the Father, Christ, to rule the nations, which is part of the Davidic promises of Psalm 2, Psalm 45, Psalm 72, Psalm 89. So this is landing here. If the kingdom of the world belongs to God, Christ, and the saints, when did they ever advocate that rule? And if the government of God is upon the earth, which is what the city descending means in Revelation 21, can they show me where the city ascended back to heaven? So the reality is that the picture is the kingdom belongs to the saints, and for those dead and alive, they're ruling with Christ. I don't believe in a literal rapture, so those alive and remaining would
perfect. Okay, perfect. Let me go ahead and respond to Scott Schaefer He's asking me, I really want to know what these questions have to do with IO. Scott Schaefer, these questions are very pertinent to IO because IO believes in a physical rapture. And Don Preston has stated that if there was, in fact, a physical rapture in 70 AD, then Christianity ended in 70 AD. Therefore, that gives credence to the IO preterists. This is why they have a covenant body resurrection. And again, Scott, this is just the facts. It's an objective fact. So he says, please ask Mike how to explain how he thinks these questions relate to IO. If you knew the IO doctrine, which I'm very affluent in the IO doctrine, all of these questions that I've heard are very much pertinent to the IO doctrine, namely the conclusive factor of IO. So I just want to go ahead and address Scott Schaefer's question on this. Let me go ahead and get to Lily's question. She says, how did the first century saints, and Mike, you understand this question very much. This is one that originated from myself, I believe. How did the first century saints experience the change in mortality?
Yeah. I don't know. I'm again disappointed. I don't know. I've already established, based on some of the terminology, that they believed in a post 70 AD reality, right? And you're asking me what was the change to immortality. So that's my view of full preterism and how I believe the change took place. I believe the change is in line with 2 Corinthians 3, 17 through 18. The Lord is a spirit. Where the spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty, and we should all, with unveiled face, the glory of the Lord, beholding in a mirror to the same image, are being transformed, metamorphio, to change into one form to another, from glory to glory, even by the Spirit of the Lord. So if the process of the change wasn't biological, and I don't believe the culmination of their change was biological. The change, when you look at Corinthians, Paul uses the Greek word endoio, where he says, put on immortality. And if you look at the Greek word endoio, Paul uses it, I think, about 10 times. And it's never about a change of biology. For Paul, endoio, to be clothed with immortality, or when he says put on the heavenly man, that is in line with covenantal change. So anyway, look up the Greek, and in whole 1 Corinthians 15, he has a bracket with this inclusio dealing with Hosea 6, Hosea, I think it's 13, all tied to covenant. And so the reality is the Hadean realm was the place of the dead. Death reigned from Adam to Moses. Christ is the firstborn from among the dead ones, which isn't really biology. He has the keys of Hades, because that was the more important resurrection, was the first to be in the highest place or realm or heaven with the Father. And his, as the firstborn, he's going to bring others with him. Anyway, if the change was not biological, as I pointed out in Corinthians, it's not going to be the consummation or the climax of that change is not biological. Good.
Okay. We have Eastgate Adoptionist. Does IO claim that Gentiles didn't have anything to repent of?
Does IO
claim that Gentiles? Yeah, according to yeah.
Does IO claim that the nations didn't have anything? Yes, they would argue that Jesus only came to save those who were under the law. But I pointed out in Romans, in Corinthians, in Acts, that there were nations that were never under the law, and they were under the law, a natural law, which, well, I do like Philo, but the reality is Jews believed in this kind of natural law, that they had this legal mechanism by their conscience and thoughts that alone demonstrated that they were just as sinful as those under the Mosaic law. All were under sin, all were under death. Christ is redeeming those from Adam to Moses. Adam, Noah, Melchizedek, Abraham, Job, they weren't under the Mosaic law, but Christ's redemption covered them as well. So the New Jerusalem cannot be for just Israelites, because how does Adam get in? How does Noah and Enoch and Job and Melchizedek and even Abraham? So this myopic view of IO.
Let me go ahead and get. Okay. Let me go ahead and get to Sun Power Solar. If the change was covenantal, how should Christians live today? Do we still apply the don't marry what was the purpose of that advice? Again, I'm just reading off the questions that they're given to
Yeah,
me. And
Tristan.
again, many of these questions, yeah, Mike, let me just say that many of these questions were emailed to me before this took place. So that's all I'm doing. I'm just giving them the opportunity for you to directly address their questions. That's it.
Yeah, but I gave an hour presentation with a lot of scriptures and sources, and I don't think anything was addressed. And these are kind of just, I don't want to say they're not relevant, but anyway, if the change was covenantal, how should Christians live today? Do we still? You changed the screen. I was reading the question. Go back, Tristan.
I did. Let me go. I know you're reading it off. Let me go ahead and go back on.
If the change was covenantal, how should Christians live today? Would still apply that do not marry advice. What was the purpose of that advice? No, that was part of the eschaton. When Corinthians, we're in a new heaven and earth. We're in the age of righteousness. And according to the whole paradigm of Revelation 21:22, we're enjoying the presence of God. You can eat and drink of the healing leaves and the water of life, or you choose not to. There's no wrath. There's no eschatological day of the Lord. There's no Satan. There's no Hades. So anyway, Mike, if you're in age to come, why are you married?
Okay.
Charles, he's still postulating that. So when I think it's the three Gospels, he says, well, let me pull it up. Mark 12. Okay. Yeah, so I don't accept your understanding of Mark 12 and this whole account of when Jesus is talking to the Sadducees about the 7 husbands, and the first took a wife and left no seed. So sort of what happens in the afterlife. And Mark's is the earliest gospel, and it's just, I'm going to keep it simple. He says, in the resurrection, therefore, when they shall rise, whose wife shall it be? For the 7 had her the 7 had her to wife. And Jesus answering said to her, do you not, what version am I reading here? Yeah, King James. Okay. Sorry, just missed it. Just passed it over. Okay. In the resurrection, when they shall rise, whose wife shall it be? For the 7 had her to wife. Jesus answering, do not therefore err, do not know the scripture and the power of God. For when they shall rise from the dead, okay, he's speaking of those who physically died. They neither marry nor given in marriage, but the angels are in heaven. Now, Luke and Matthew, those in the age to come and the resurrection, but I'm tying it all to those who physically died. If those who physically died achieve both the age to come and the resurrection, then they're not going to marry. There's no. I don't think there's marrying in heaven. You're like the angels, so it's not for that which is on earth. I don't agree with that understanding of Charlie.
Okay.
It's for those who physically.
Here's from Lance Conley. Okay, here's one from Lance Conley. Can Mike name anyone not related to Abraham that worships and follows Yahweh?
Can Mike name anyone not related to Abraham that worships and follows Yahweh? Yeah, well, the ones that I just mentioned prior to Abraham, and keep this in mind, guys, that from Adam to Moses, there's 2,000 years of history. They weren't under the laws of Moses. So obviously, there were people of faith, and there were people that would be designated as sinful, and that's why Paul alludes to death passed from Adam to Moses. But sure, among Abraham's household and the fighting men, there would have been those who had faith in Yahweh. Rahab had faith in Yahweh. The Kenizzite had faith in Yahweh. Under the nation of Israel, the strangers had faith in Yahweh. Israel only is a misnomer. It's a non-argument. It doesn't exist in the sense that it's never been just about Israel. Good.
Okay. Here we have Jeremy from New Heavens and New Earth. He says maybe ask him what time period he believes the many days of Hosea refers to in Hosea 3.
Shout out, Jeremy.
And how Ephraim was restored. Shout out to Jeremy. Yeah, go ahead.
Been a while. Yeah, I wish he was a little more specific as far as Ephraim's restoration. So I do believe that most of the regathering and restoration passages of the Old Testament should be understood as having a more immediate fulfillment for both houses coming out of Babylon. Matter of fact, in Jeremiah 50, it says, when Babylon is judged, in those days and at that time, Israel would be restored. So I believe that there was a remnant of both houses who were restored in, I think it's Ezra 8. I think it's 6 or 8. God restored the covenant, restored the priesthood, restored atonement for all 12 tribes. All 12 tribes are represented. Now, Hosea is a little tricky because Hosea deals with this. I think it's a great number of them. I think it's in Hosea 1. And to be honest with you, I don't even see that as finding any fulfillment in history. So,
okay, Mike, I got a question for you. It's not like a question of anything you presented, but I just want to know your opinion on Don Preston's dancing in the streets notion. I'd just like to know, what is your opinion when he had stated this with Richard Carrier? That's just my own personal question. It's just your opinion. That's all that it is.
next question.
All right. Let me see. 21st century mind. Why the remnant of both houses? You mean Israel? Is what they're saying. The remnant of both houses. You mean Israel? Some Power Solar would like for you to ask this. And I asked this, Mike, because some in the chat were asking about this, so that's why I asked you personally.
The remnant of both houses.
But some Power Solar is saying the remnant of both sides. You mean Israel? Yeah.
Yeah. Both houses: House of Judah, House of Israel. Yeah, matter of fact, in Ezra's exile, in the first wave of coming back, I think it's Asher, and those would have been remnants of Asher. And so, part of the Judean community that was exiled under Babylon would have consisted of those among the 10 tribes. As a matter of fact, it's my view that when Jesus is seeking, the reason why Israel only doesn't work is because when Jesus is going to find lost sheep of Israel, it's including both houses. It's my opinion that most of the 10 tribes would have been within that land of Canaan, which is Jesus goes through Galilee and northwards of Tyre. But even in Matthew 4, he's quoting from Isaiah 9 about Naphtali and Zebulun and saying this is fulfilled. So I don't believe this whole, it was only the southern kingdom. In other words, Jesus is going to pass by Anna from Asher in Luke 2. Like, Anna, sorry, it's just not your time. I haven't come for the 10 tribes. I'm just coming for the Jews. So anyway, I don't even know where I went with that. But just to say, if there were 10 tribes, it would have been more in the land of that particular area of the Canaan and Assyria, which is where Ezra's and Josephus said that they were. Not that there weren't pockets of families scattered throughout the empire, but there's no evidence they lived anywhere near the Jews in reference to their synagogues. That's something you can't find in history.
All right, I got True Dat. He says the kingdom was delivered to the father. True Dat. The kingdom was delivered to the father in 70 AD. How can you claim you are part of the kingdom today? Looks like the conclusive arguments from Israel only. What do you have to say in response?
The kingdom was delivered. So that's, again, in line with Daniel. And there were powers, and the kingdom in Matthew 13, Christ is cleaning out the kingdom of all that corrupts. So there was a putting under his feet all his enemies, and that kingdom was delivered, and that was the end, the eschaton. But as far as continuation, obviously you have the end, the gospel shall preach to all the world, and the end will come. That end is tied again to Daniel, alludes to the end probably a dozen times. That end was focused on the end of the temple and the city and that Mosaic temple cultus, that age. So the kingdom was delivered to the Father, but what happened? So in Daniel 7, you have judgment. The kingdoms and the right to rule over nations is given to the Son of Man. Daniel recapitulates the judgment, then it's shown as being given to the saints. So there is no notion of a kingdom that exists that is not dealing with those underneath. In other words, the kingdom means basilia, and it means power, rule, dominion. The fact that there's a kingdom means that there are outside nations, which Revelation 21 alludes to. So that kingdom never passes away. It says that in Luke, right? I think it's Luke 2, or Daniel says that kingdom will never pass away. Revelation 11 says the kingdom of the world becomes God and the Son, and they'll rule forever. So I'm part of the kingdom because the kingdom has never ceased. And that's why I said, if the kingdom, I asked the question, when did the Father and the Son and the saints abdicate their rule over earth? If there's a new heaven and earth, there's new rulership. I'm a part of the kingdom because I'm coming through the merit and graces that come through Christ, because we're in the age of righteousness, and that only comes through Christ. So I don't, unless you can show me where the kingdom ends. IO focuses on the end narrative, but the end served as the pivot point and transition to the new. And I told you, Matthew 21, when after the judgment, they would be given the kingdom rights to rule. That's Matthew 21. In Matthew 25, when Christ returns, real quick, Matthew 25, then they're giving the inheritance of the kingdom. So this idea that the kingdom in 1 Corinthians 15 is a cessation of the kingdom, he's delivering the kingdom to the Father in the same way that David delivered the kingdom. So in Psalm 110, it says that the Lord set it on the Lord's right hand to bring his enemies under his feet. He uses the word until. But when David brought his enemies under his feet, it says that he was in the palace and God gave him rest from his enemies. So it doesn't mean cessation of rule. It means that Christ has defeated his enemies. He's given the kingdom to the Father.
You're true that.
Now the Father rules.
Let me just interject. True. Let me interject. True Dat has he has a second part to the question. He says continuation means futurism, and he's saying that you sound like a futurist. So I mean, I'm sure that's where you're getting at.
Yeah, well, I'd say that's a dumb comment because, again, from Enoch to the apocryphal texts, Essenes, they all understood the end was served as the beginning. So all prophecy with the Messianic age and a restoration of Israel, as far as the eschaton, understood that this kingdom would have no end. So yes, there was an end to the Mosaic age and the age of death that ran from Adam to Moses. So they're conflating the end with the new. So the fact is there was an end in play, and there was a new age, a new kingdom, a new nation, a new temple, a new city. So they're almost like burying their head in the sand. I'm a futurist. In a sense, all prophecy has been fulfilled, but part of the prophecy includes the new. So I don't think I'm in the wrong. I think that they're misframing this whole notion of what the end meant.
Okay. We have Jack Shadow, the cultivated tree in Romans 11. What was that tree in the first century world?
Cultivated tree. So the root and the first fruit would have been tied to the Abrahamic promises. The olive tree is Israel. The nations are the unnatural tree, the wild olive tree, which proves that they're not Israelites, because Israel is the natural branches. And the wild olive tree is never stated that they're being regrafted back in. That's only something that's tied to the Israelites. And I have a question for you as well. Why, when the nations are grafted in, they don't become Israel if they were Israel. So why is Israel, when she's the natural and she's cut off, she's still retaining her name Israel? She returns, she's still called Israel. But the nations are Israelites, but they're never called Israel. And then when they're grafted in, they're still not called Israelites. That doesn't make sense. That is framed around the first century. But to this day, there's a continuation because it all is part of this, all part of God's plan, serving the last. The first century served as the last stop in God's covenantal program. So that has no end. I don't know what he means by the cultivated tree. Was that the tree in the first century? In a sense, we're all tied to the tree, but there is a kind of narrative that only is focused on that first century. So,
All right. Well, we're at the 2 hour mark, as a matter of fact. And Mike, I want to tell you, this was a great presentation on your behalf. I want to thank you so very much for taking the time, to represent full preterism, for answering everyone's questions. I do believe that I went through everyone's questions that was emailed to me. If I did not get to your question, I believe maybe there could have been one or two that was emailed to me. It was quite long. I tried to look after it, but for some reason I'm not able to open it up. But if you have any questions, you guys, please, let's go ahead and wrap it up now. If I did not get to your question, or if you feel that I did not get to your question, please go ahead and type it in, so that way, I can, let your voice be heard. Mike, thank you so very much once again. I think that, like I said before, you're stepping up to the plate where other full preterists are not. And so again, thank you for that. I think that there are many who can benefit from this discussion. So again, I have Scott Schaefer saying, thanks, 21st Century Mind, for putting this together, Tristan, of course, but this is all Mike, because Mike is the one who is stepping up to the plate. For weeks, he has been getting hit on all sides, and he just has the courage to continue. And I have the utmost respects for Mike for challenging IO. And regardless of our differences, you guys are in conclusions. This is just theology talk, ladies and gentlemen. It's just theology talk. That's all that it is. Mike, Don had praised you publicly. Let me ask you a question. And the other question that I had, people were asking me if I could ask. But listen, Mike, Don gave you a public affirmation. I mean, how does that feel? I mean, my goodness, you are, a voice in full preterism, for Don to recognize you and say kind words to you. I just want to know, how does that make you feel?
amazing. Now, in all kidding, I just want to add some final thoughts, if I could. Listen, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Don and William Bell and my main man, Elvin, who's just a true origin and a mystic and one of the most amazing men that I know. A shout out to Sam Frost, to you, to Lance, all these people in this community, and shout out to you, Tristan, for pressing the issue, or urging us to discuss, urging us to have debates and interactions. And to be honest, I hate tension and I hate drama. So that's why I'm not alluding to any of that. But I think I just want to thank everyone, because iron sharpens iron. And I really want to thank Derek Lambert, because Derek, he crossed this bridge long before I did. And he had 6 to 8 probably New Testament scholars who had at least some on the surface, some deeper, looking into Israel only. And to my understanding, that they've all rejected the conclusions raised by IO. But Derek is the one who's spent the time, probably money, in having these scholars come in. And one of the things that sort of helped me understand how IO is unbiblical is, see, what scholars do is something IO doesn't do. And it's called the grammatical historical hermeneutic. In other words, when Paul's speaking, what scholars do is they want to unpack, well, let's figure out the cultural milieu, the socio-religious, linguistic backdrop of the first century, the language that Paul used, how is it used by other contemporaries of Jews? When I point out the fact, and again, this whole notion of historical revisionism. So Israel only says that in Ephesians 2, the tension was between Jews and the 10 tribes. Under national Israel, when they were two houses, that was the case, right? But in the first century, that wasn't the case. The tension was between Jews and non-Jews, because you had Jews, and I could read, I prepared a bunch of sources, but nonetheless, is the tension was between Jews and their tradition, dividing between, you can't eat with this person. You have to have the wall in the temple was dividing the Israelites amongst non-Gentiles, right? When Peter is like, I can't sit with these Gentiles because they were unclean, that's a tradition thing, right? So the issue was also the circumcision and uncircumcision. There was the proselytes and the God-fearers, proselyte of the gate called them. They didn't want to become circumcised, right? The Greeks loved their private parts. They thought it was a perfect organ. And so they looked down on circumcision. And so this caused issues. You can read the schools of Hillel, and I forget the other school that wrestled with Jews and non-Jews and circumcision. But anyway, I just want to say that the whole framework of IO is mythology. It really is. It has aspects when you deal with Jesus and the original apostles as they're going to the lost sheep. But Luke, in my opinion, is actually writing Acts. I don't believe Luke was an Israelite. He's writing Acts as an apologetic to provide a basis for Gentile inclusion to Theodosius. Is that his name? I forget. Theophilus. So he's writing about Paul's ministry, and it's geared towards the nations, the non-Israelites, and that's the world of Paul. Like it or not, that's the world of Paul. I'm sorry, Tristan, you seem bored, and I don't want to take any more time. But anyway, thank you for allowing me to speak.
No, not at all. No. I trust me, I'm not bored at all. I can go on for hours. We're at the 2-hour mark, and Mike, like I said before, you have my utmost respects because you were willing to, go into the lion's den, day after day in the Facebook community. And I'm just asking for the IOers, there's memes that are being made. There's a lot of flack and backlash. You guys, please, if you guys could give Mike some respects. He's somebody who is passionate for Bible theology, just like yourself. He's walking into the IO lion's den. And there are other full preterists who won't do this, who openly say that they have no interest for the IO preterists, even though the IO preterists came from Max Kingism. So they're covenant blood brothers. And so I want to say that Mike has deserved the recognition that he's got from Don, who, Don is the leading voice of full preterism. I stated earlier in a post, Mike, that you are now the leading voice of full preterism because, you're the one who's, directly. Yeah, I hope not. But, you're the one that's directly going after the IO controversy. So I want to give you my respect for that, Mike.
Tristan?
And, I hope that, yes.
One more thought. I want to give a shout out to Mike Miano. I actually live near two full preterist churches, Johnny Ova, Mike Miano. And actually, people wonder how a full preterist church, or if there's a template or a model full preterist church. These brothers, I mean, the way they serve their communities, the outreaches that they offer, being a light to the nations and bringing healing to the nations. I commend Johnny Ova, Mike Miano. I commend David Curtis, Holger Neubauer, Travis Strum, who was the other brother. Anyway, the bottom line is it's working, it's growing. And I think that Tristan, for someone who is maybe an agnostic, but has rejected Christianity, the beautiful thing about full preterism is, listen, you're not going to eradicate Christianity, but the full preterist model is actually a beautiful thing to Orthodox Christianity that has conflated Israel, conflated Moses with Jesus, invented this kind of dispensationalism. In other words, Orthodox Christianity has a lot of flaws. And I think if you can bring a full preterist model that doesn't tell you you're under Adamic curse or Mosaic curse or, you know, this demonic spirits and Satan's hiding behind every corner and Jesus is coming back, so sell your goods and don't go to school and we're going to go to war with the Jews and Islam. And anyway, I think that IO should actually support full preterism, and we should all combat the fallacies of Orthodox Christianity. Thank you.
So are you trying to bring a unification with the IO preterists and the full preterists?
Well, it's just interesting. You guys, I guess, spend a lot of time here. Maybe that's where you guys were birthed. But the reality is we have common enemies with, you know, some of these doctrines and views and practices of Orthodox Christianity that, you know, we both could do without. And I'm just saying that full preterism is actually appeals to the same God you believe in. In other words, you believe a God who's probably, if he exists, he's universal in scope. There's not a lot of the ancient Near Eastern tradition tied to this particular God. And when I look in Revelation 21:22, this new heaven and earth, it's the picture of God that I believe and I think that would serve the world well. In other words, we're both not going to say exactly the elements that we just brought out, these false messiahs and these doomsday cults and Satan and sort of all the stuff that makes Christianity kind of gives people a bad taste in their mouth, which it did for you. So I think the qualities of the God that I believe in is probably similar to the God that you may or would like to believe in.
Okay. And again, Mike, there are people who are text me, they're, hitting me up on the Facebook Messenger, asking me to ask questions. There are some even in the chat right now, questioning about Jason DaCosta. Would you, if Jason DaCosta was willing, I guess is what I'm reading here, would you ever be interested in engaging with him, in some sort of format or, some sort of maybe a YouTube clip? Because I know he's made YouTube clips of yourself. What would be your input on that?
Well, for those who don't know, Jason DaCosta is, one of the main voices of IO, but he's actually come out with a new view that I haven't found too many IO opponents holding to, which is that Jesus, when he came for the lost sheep, he came for all 12 tribes. And that later on, Jesus is like, you know what? Let's get Ephraim in there. Ephraim is a 13th tribe. So he's got some new views. But the thing is, I'm not a charismatic guy, right? I don't like debates because debates are mostly the victor goes to the one who's charismatic, the one who's good looking.
Okay.
Jason DaCosta's, he's got both. I'm just a regular Joe trying to wrestle through these. And this format is perfect for me because I don't do good under that kind of format. But I would love someone to debate Jason DaCosta. I wouldn't mind a cordial discussion, but I'm not going to debate him.
Okay. Yeah. And again, I'm just trying to give the viewers, those in the Facebook, groups, I'm just trying to give them a voice. They're asking questions. I even see questions here in the comment section. And like I said before, Mike,
this conversation spurs others from IO, others from full preterism to get involved. This is not my cup of tea, right? I mean, I like to research and I like to study and I believe what I believe, but there's much more potent and powerful speakers. And I'll in support of some of the OGs like William Bell and Don Preston and Larry Siegel, they've already covered these. This stuff is new to like a lot of us, but this ground was covered years ago. So when these OGs don't get involved, it's because they've already dismissed IO. They've already had these discussions. And so I don't blame them for not really getting involved because they've already crossed this bridge. IO's trash. And
Well, yeah.
maybe
Well, I
this
mean,
will
I
incite
got
some
to
of them.
say, I got to say that I would wish, and I hear what you're saying, Mike. I would wish that Don and William Bell would directly address IO in a morning musing series where I could look up the title, and it says Israel only. I was offering Don money for this when I was a full preterist, where we can just look it up on the title. I know that there are written articles that were given, but I just would like for more of the full preterist voices, just like yourself, to directly address this Israel only doctrine. That's all.
Yeah, and I don't have a YouTube channel. I got maybe 3 videos, but I do have one on dealing with IO specifically. So, matter of fact, I don't even remember the name of my YouTube. If you want to look up Michael Karras and uh, the Gentiles, I think it'll pull it up. So, but I thought it was a good video. A lot of resources in there.
All right. Well, I'll go ahead and wrap it up. I gave the comment section plenty of time to give any questions. And again, to those of you watching, I want to again apologize for this lag that's happening here. With the internet. Like I said, I live up in these hill areas, and sometimes it's hit and miss. I had an interview earlier today, and went absolutely perfect. And now I could see that there's a lag here, but I will get this fixed eventually. So I do apologize for this eyesore. However, the audio is pretty good quality. So those of you guys that like to listen to this, while driving or whatever have you, the audio is still good quality. But I do deeply apologize for this lag that's happening now. So at the end of the day, Mike, is there any final words before you sign off?
I just want to tell Charlie I love him. That's all. Charlie Patterson.
Charlie. All right. All right. And,
But no, I
Mike, I got to tell
appreciate
you, you are a good man. You are a good sport. Perfect.
that.
And there has to be some love, you guys, in the IO community, because at the end of the day, we're still brethren in humanity. This is just, theology talk. It's just Bible talk. And, we are passionate towards these topics, but please, you guys, if I may ask, especially in the Facebook world, let's show some magnanimity, let's show some respect. Mike has come up and he has done what other full preterist voices have refused to do. And so that right there, I respect Mike for that. Look, we got Lily. She says, "We love you, Mike." I'm going to go ahead and post
Oh,
this so
Lily.
everyone
Shout
can
out to
see.
Lily. Yeah, God
Um,
bless. And real quick, Justin. Uh,
yeah,
so,
yes.
going into the Lions Den, this specific Facebook forum, that I can be a little abrasive. So I apologize to Lily and anyone that I may have offended with some of the rhetoric.
Okay.
And me and Charlie have made amends. And actually, I want to commend you, Tristan. So people don't know, we had a dialogue many months ago. And it really wasn't supposed to be a debate, but it was more of a discussion debate. But because I valued you so much, I said, Tristan, I don't want to get involved in any theological discussions with you. And to your credit, you kept through that, which makes me, which makes you appreciate you, because you value people over theology. So that's a testament to you, and I
That's absolutely
appreciate it.
correct. Absolutely correct. Thank you, Mike. And let me go ahead and make this. I want to take the opportunity now. It must be the Valentine's Day spirit. I don't know, but I got to say, I do love humanity. I look at the human first before the person. And if I could just make this public declaration, Michael Bradley, if you're listening, I do like you as a human being. We do have some beef in the past, and I want to go ahead and extend my offer of truce to you, Michael Bradley, if you're listening to this. I know that, maybe I'm blocked. I don't know, maybe you unblock me. But, I simply want to offer my truce to you. And I would like to offer this reconciliation between myself and Michael Bradley. Any of the full preterist voices, Don and William Bell, I've told Don personally that this is just theology business behind closed doors. I absolutely respect Don. I absolutely like this man. I admire this man. And to me, this is just business to me. when it comes to theology. But human to human, I don't take this at all personal, and I do wish everybody nothing but the best, personally, with them and their families. And at the end of the day, I'm just trying to be genuine in my approach, and give everybody, a voice in the preterist community, those in the Facebook groups. And so, just like what Lily states here, no hard feelings, Mike. We are all friends here, and that's exactly how I feel in my heart of hearts. So if anybody, we do come across brazen, we do come across each other on the Facebook group sometimes, making videos and stuff. But I do want to say that Mike is definitely a good man. I've spoken to Mike personally. He's a good, sincere man. And if it wasn't for religion, we wouldn't be having these, this disunity. But because we are passionate for religion, whether you're for it or against it, unfortunately, we have these. But at the end of the day, Mike, I want to tell you that I do sincerely respect you as a man. And anybody else, I have zero enemies in my life. And I try to live my life where I don't have to offer any apologies. But again, if there's anybody in the Facebook group that wishes to, come on and have a voice, I will treat you with utmost respects, and ethics and decorum. So at the end of the day, Mike, thank you so very much. Everybody in the comment section, thank you so very much.
God bless.
I want to thank everybody's, yes, I want to thank everybody's interest in this topic. This book called the Bible is still at the center of my life, even though I don't believe the Bible applies to me today, even though I am a skeptic. But it's going to be men like you, Mike, that is going to win over the skeptics and atheists, the agnostics, if they are going to be won over. It's going to be men like you, Mike, who are willing to step up and, just simply show that, you have the courage to win souls, so I just want to go ahead and put that out there. Thank you, Mike, for having that courage, having that fortitude, that gumption, to simply let your voice be heard and to hopefully make a difference in your worldview and those around you. So thank you so very much. Mike, any last words before we sign off?
No, sir. Thank you for the opportunity, the platform, and I pray we all grow in grace and knowledge, and sharpen iron. So thanks for the opportunity.
Okay. Thank you so very much, everyone. Have a wonderful Sunday. And I believe tomorrow is President's Day, so there are a lot of people off from work. So if you have the day off, enjoy your day off. I sure am. And so, anyways, thank you, Mike. And I'm looking forward to engaging with you more in the future. And hopefully, by the time somebody else comes on this podcast, this internet lag will stop. And I'm going to do everything I can to stop it. But thank you, Mike. Thank you for your time, your performance, and for addressing the questions at hand. Thank you so very much. Everyone, signing off. Adios.